Global South, Concepts and Cinema. I'm very privileged to welcome each and everyone to the venue KATHA.
It's my proud privilege today to share this wonderful stage at KLF with Professor Dilip Menon, who, as you know, is a historian exemplar, and I think if you look at modern history, what he has not touched would be a smaller list than what he has actually touched. I would like to start the session with a recent remark that you had made, that historians have forgotten the histories of the sea. There are also historians like Pius Malikandathil and Sanjay Subramaniam, for instance, has done amazing work, particularly when you look at the pre-modern period. But unfortunately, their works have not entered into a popular discourse. So when you're referring to the histories of the sea, I'm also imagining that you're not only talking about the Indian Ocean, but the larger sea travel. And in your work, there's this particular word concept, because almost all the words that you've mentioned and all the wonderful authors that you've compiled together in your work, they talk about different kinds of words which make worlds. And one of those words is I might be butchering the pronunciation here, so please feel free to correct me. This is a word called renatu, which talks about wandering, and particularly moving across a watery landscape, which I found to be absolutely fascinating. It's something that a lot of us historians can actually use. So what would be your comments on how travel and movement and migration, how that has started making its entry into our conventional historiography, but there's still a long way to go.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's good that people are reading my books, because otherwise it was largely my sisters who did so. So there's a larger audience here. So when I say that historians don't engage with the sea, I don't mean it empirically, because any number of historians, as Malavika mentioned, Sanjay Subramaniam, Pius Malikandathil, it's about thinking with the sea conceptually. So for example, when we think about the history of modern Kerala, you have Janmampatam, you have the temple, you have the Nadavari, and so on. And you would think that Kerala is somewhere in Madhya Pradesh, right? Whereas Kerala has been continuous with the ocean for over 1,000 years. So Balakrishna Valla, when he begins to write his articles in Madhurumi in 1935, he asks the question about, he begins writing about Rome while he's writing about Kerala. And he asks the question, is Rome a chapter in the history of Kerala, or is Kerala a chapter in the history of Rome? And this something is something that's very evident to the ordinary person in Kerala, because the average Malayali is not in Kerala. They are in Dubai, they are in Canada, they are all over the place. And our literature reflects that. Whether you think about Vilasini's Avagashigal, whether you think about T.D. Ramakrishnan's book Mama Africa, you think about the Changutam of K.R. Meera writing a novel set in Calcutta. See, so there's something here that we need to talk about, where the ocean informs our imagination, but somehow our histories haven't begun to reckon with that. So the second thing that follows from this is that, are there places that are far away from the ocean, right? And here is the question of actually listening for water. We have to listen and read and see. So that even a place like Madhya Pradesh, in the 18th century, was connected with China through the cotton trade. And it was the destruction of that cotton trade that then led to the phenomenon of Thagi. Right? So every space in the world is connected to the ocean, not surprising, given that 70% of the earth is water. Right? And so when you think about that, what it reminds us is that there are many histories we have not written, because you've concentrated on the histories of the upper middle classes, the elite, and so on. Whereas if you go back to 2015, 2016, one of the most significant phenomena was all of these people from Syria and North Africa who were walking across water, right? There's a historically recorded miracle of people who walked across water into Germany, and subsequent interviews with them revealed that 90% of them had not seen the sea earlier, nor did they know how to swim. Now that's Changuta, right? To do that. I mean, I don't know how to swim, I won't even venture into a swimming pool. So when we think about all of this, then we have to ask ourselves, what are the concepts we need to use? To come to the third question that you asked. And here the thing is that our social sciences are trapped in a discourse and a social theory that comes from somewhere else. We begin to write about Malappuram or Pathanamthitta and we think we need to bring in Foucault, Deleuze, Levinas, and so when France catches a cold, Kerala sneezes. Right? So how do we move beyond this? And here is where I found it interesting to think with the idea that we need to think with the words that people use. That words don't come to us from theory, words don't come to us from dictionaries, as Mikhail Bakhtin told us, words come to us from people's mouths, from their experience. How do we use those words in order to write history? And hence the word that Malavika mentioned, the word merantau, which is in the Indonesian language Bahasa, where people are constantly on the move, moving across the ocean in search of work, coming back, and there's this constant cycle of relating to the sea. The sea is connected to the land. The sea is not just something that is on the borders of one's mind. Another word that's there in the book is musafir, right? Which is set in Balochistan. Balochistan, as you know, is a landlocked area in Pakistan, very much oppressed by the state machinery there. But the phenomenon that is central to Balochistan is the phenomenon of the traveler, the musafir, a word that's there in Swahili, Arabic, Hindi, Persian, Urdu, and so on, where people constantly travel to escape oppression, to make better lives for themselves, sometimes gratuitously, traveling because they want to. So that is the phenomenon we need to understand, that the world is in a state of movement, concentrating on states, classes, agrarian relations, kings. That is a historiography that doesn't allow us to capture human experience as it is. And John Kurian is here, he writes about fisher people. And one of the things which he pointed out many years ago is that when we talk about Kerala, very rarely do we talk about the fisher people. We eat a lot of fish, but the fisher people are not central to our imagination, people who spend their lives at sea. Right? In order that they may be Karimeen and Waha and all the rest of it. But
absolutely. So, for instance, you have a volume of information on fisher folk, even in the Madilagam records, which is a Travancore Royal Archive. Now, you would see fishermen being prosecuted, or their entire wealth and their houses being ransacked and ransomed just for crossing certain limits into the sea, because there was also a limit in the sea for them. At the same time, if they also cross the limit into land, if they moved past a certain limit, which was the caste transgressive limit, then again the king had the right to completely raze down their houses. So the idea that you put for that, we need to think with the ocean, while at the same time, when in conventional historiography, particularly I think in Indian ocean studies, there is a conspicuous absence of histories of fisherfolk, conspicuous absence of people who live near the coast. Quite often the entire focus is on traders or merchants or how religions moved across it. Those are important. But at the same time, there's a marginalia around the coast, which completely is invisibilized. Yeah. Now, on the question of invisibilities, there's also this wonderful essay. I think it's one of the last essays in your work, Orsini's essays, on the idea of Aukat. And quite often, I think it's a term that all of us can identify with. Anyone who has seen a Bollywood movie would know the term Aukat. Quite often it is used in the context of Tere Aukat Kya Hai. Now she traces out how it is intimately linked to the idea of Waqt. How this idea of status is, as you mentioned in your work, is joined at the hips with the idea of time. And how there is this time status interconnection that we have. And I think that's an absolutely interesting connection, where one's status is linked to the amount of time. And in a country like India, where there are
ഈ സെഷൻ ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലാണ്. അല്ല, ഞാൻ ഇത് കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് നിങ്ങൾക്ക് നിങ്ങളുടെ കൂടെ സംസാരിക്കാം. നമുക്കൊരു ചായ കുടിച്ചിട്ട് ഞാൻ ഇപ്പൊ പറഞ്ഞതെല്ലാം ഞാൻ മലയാളത്തിൽ പറയാം.
നമുക്ക് മലയാളികൾ അല്ലാത്ത ആൾക്കാരും ഇവിടെ ഉണ്ടായിരിക്കില്ലേ? അതുകൊണ്ടല്ലേ ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലെ സെഷൻ വെക്കുന്നത്. So you have this idea of waqt and its intimate connections with Aukat, and these are terms which are worth exploring, because you do talk about the idea of us needing to go beyond the idea of multidisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity to a space where multilinguality will make words alive, which will open up entry points for us into making clear or making intelligible the worlds of meaning that others may carry or that which we might imbibe. So this idea that you have put forth through the entire work, there are a lot of interesting concepts, but at the same time, these are also concepts which we might have thought about, but we might not have words or concepts to articulate. So these terms, such as Oka, becomes even more interesting when you place it in terms of the trajectories of caste that we have in India. So what are your comments on?
Actually, this raises a whole set of questions. I mean, your questions are encyclopedic, right? You're asking me many things, and I'll try and do the ancient strategy of reducing it to 3. So,
But why 3?
Well, otherwise,
go beyond 3 as well.
Yeah, we could talk till the cows come home. So the question here is that, see, very often the concepts that we take for granted when we study India, right? So we have courses on Indian society, for example. But one of the things that Dalit thinkers like Aniket Zavre and Gopal Guru have asked is, do we have something called society in India? Right? The spaces around are not open to everybody. We are governed by caste, we are governed by hierarchy, violence, inegalitarianism. The question of does the Dalit have a right to life in India is not a question that can be easily answered. And in contemporary India, what we have seen is the Dalitization of the Muslim with the rise of Hindutva, where the lives of Muslims are considered as cheap as the lives of the Dalit. So these are whole landscapes of what does it mean to continue studying society, which is really a fictional entity. We don't touch one another. We don't sit with each other. We don't marry each other. So our sociology has to arise from those circumstances, as Ambedkar reminded us, that there is a deep biological trench that runs through society. He also said that in one sentence he captured was what India was about. He said India is characterized by a rising hierarchy, ascending hierarchy of reverence and a descending hierarchy of contempt. No better description of India can exist. So given all of this, the question is, what are the concepts we are to work with? Can we just look to Marx, look to theory that comes from elsewhere? This also takes us to a question that you raised of the sea, for example. I'll be talking about it more on the last day. So one of the ideas that we constantly encounter in the literature on migration is the idea of Kala Pani. Right, that people were forbidden to cross the seas, but this applied only to the Brahmins. Right? What about the fishermen? They lived in the sea. Or think about the number of tracts and pamphlets that I looked at in the British Library, where you had in the early 20th century Pulayas and Cheramas who would travel to Basra, to Penang, to all over the world on the ocean, write books called Basarapata, Pinangabata. And they would come back after having made money, build houses back in Kerala, and launch their children onto a second generation of success. But these pamphlets are hardly ever talked about, because these are the travels made by those who were labor. Right? And that's one of the ways in which we see this great condescension that exists in India. Think about the time of COVID, when labor was abandoned by the state. You had all of these people walking back from Western India to Eastern India, walking along rail tracks, bicycles, carrying family, dying along the way. This needs to be the substance of our history. So what are the concepts that we can actually raise from these? So are we to work with the idea of Kala Pani, or are we to work with the idea that the subaltern was always at sea, literally and metaphorically? Right? So these kinds of questions demand that the history of India needs to be written differently, the history of Kerala needs to be written differently. So what would it mean to think with the fact that the very first travelogue in any Indian language is the Vartamana Vastakam, where two priests who have never seen the sea decide to travel all the way to Rome in order to plead their case. And what is really interesting in this is that the sea has its own logic. So they decide to go from Kerala to Rome, but the winds decide to take them to Brazil. So they drift all the way to Brazil, engage in conversation with monks there in Latin and Syriac, because these Malayalis, of course, are conversant in Latin. And so, how do we think about the strangeness of the world? How do we think about the hardness of the world? How do we think about concepts that change with time? So this word Aukat, for example, where Aukat, there's a wonderful essay in the book that I edited, written by Francesca Orsini, who's an Italian, who's a professor of Hindi literature. And she speaks Hindi fluently without an English word in it. So she looks at the dictionaries and looks at the word Aukat, which relates to status. And it's a kind of way in which the upper caste constantly addresses the untouchable and says, what is your status? Okay? Aukat kya hai, as she said. And then she relates the fact to the word Aukat being etymologically connected to the notion of waqt or time. So status is a matter of time, and he carries the story forward from the 19th century to the 1990s and the rise of Mayavati and the Dalit movements, where untouchables and Dalits are asking the Zaminda, Teri Aukat kya hai? What is your status that you can oppress me? So in that word, you have a 100-year history, and a 100-year history that truly reflects the history of northern India. You remember Anand's novel Govardhana Yatra, which is the history of injustice in the Indo-Gangetic plain. But here is one word that actually explodes the history and reveals to us something new, which doesn't come to us from the reams of history, sociology, anthropology, where we try and mirror a theory that comes from somewhere else. Right?
In your work, you also mention this term. I think you are trying also to unpack this term, Euronormality, which Sudipta Kaviraj has talked about, and how the European parochial often masquerades as the universal. M.S.S. Pandian, in his work Brahman and Non-Brahman, he makes a very interesting comment, which is very similar to the comment that is made by Sudipta Kaviraj, that in India, quite often the Savarna masquerades as the secular. So you do have these issues of decolonization, where we try to dismantle the framework of decolonization, but often the dismantling is done at the expense of the indigenous non-dominant. Because often what comes up in the place of the colonial is the indigenous dominant. Where so, for instance, if you look at Ambedkar, he had this huge anxiety that once you have the colonial Raj moving away from India, you would have a move back to Savarna Hindutva. And so, when as a subaltern historian and as a Dalit Bahujan scholar, when I look at decolonization, I always have this constant anxiety that whenever we talk about indigenous epistemes, quite often the focus is on the Sanskrit. Quite often the focus is on the dominant elite text, and very little focus falls on, let's say, a Nadan Chela. Or quite often the focus does not fall on, let's say, a work like Chengenar, let's say Ayyankali's speeches, or a work which is based on Vanjipata. So when we're talking about decolonization, sometimes, even when we're looking at indigenous epistemologies, there is a certain kind of negotiation that happens, where the elite from within what is construed as the indigenous sometimes trumps the subaltern even in the global south.
It is a very important question, because when we think about the fact that, as I said, Tagore in 1917, he spoke about the tragedy of the fact that we write our histories in terms of histories that come from elsewhere, right? And this is something that's been the theme of what I'm saying. So what does it mean then to go speak with traditions of thinking, traditions of intellection from our spaces? And this is a project that can go two ways. We can see the Hindutva project, which takes us back to the Vedas, right? And say, look, colonialism was just a blip, right? It was a tragedy in our history, but let's go back to the Vedas, let's go back to the Upanishads. And very rarely do traditions of dissent and critical thought from Islam, from Jainism, from Buddhism come into this. Or indeed, as you said, Dalit epistemologies, which Kancha Ilaya has spoken about in many of his works. So what does the true project of decoloniality or decolonization involve? And here is where this has been a deep struggle for me in terms of thinking this project through, because this project arises after over 10 years, 2 conferences, many conversations, not only in Johannesburg, but in Beirut and in Europe and so on. Because one of the things that I've always worked with is that to know Kerala, it's not enough to know only Kerala, right? That to truly understand Kerala, you have to know the world. And so when we think about this question of decoloniality, we have to ask ourselves, what are the sources of knowledge that we can look to? Which is why the Concepts from the Global South book picks up on words that are circulate in everyday conversation. Right? So words that people use. So I'm just finished a paper on this idea of udukam. Right? And udukam is a word that's all familiar to you, more familiar to the women in this audience, because that's what you're brought up with from the time you're children. Adakam, udukam, menam, oracha samsarikkaradu, kaalu kootiyirikkanam, and so on and so forth. Multiple ways in which femininity and feminine comportment become important. But on the other hand, if you think about Odukam, Odukam also has the connotation of Odukuda, which is what happens within the party or party discipline. Young Turks, young men who are disciplined, right? Or people who are dissenting from the party who are disciplined. So what you have here in this one word is something that picks up on this idea of patriarchy in Kerala. We are a very progressive state, but we are also a very conservative patriarchal state. So when you think about the ways in which both men and women are disciplined into becoming men and women, or particular kinds of men and women, the word Odukam gives you an indication. The men are disciplined into a male hierarchy, the women are made subordinate to men, right? And the social contract is actually, as Carol Bateman, the Australian feminist, put it, it's a sexual contract. The social contract is between men. Right? In order to, so when we think about all of this, I think when we think the project of decolonization actually has to work with not going back somewhere to the Upanishads, nor indeed thinking only with classical thought, but to think with the everyday, what we see around us. Right? What is around us? There is inequality around us. There is the fact that you can't sit and speak in the same spaces as other people. All of these which are existential questions, they're phenomenological questions. How do we make these the subject of our inquiry? So I think that's where the decolonization project really should go in terms of understanding the everyday. I'll just end with one word that we all use all the time, right? A word which is common, chetti nadakka. It's a caste slur. It is a reference to the Irava occupation of tapping coconuts. So the word Chettinaraka originally had its origins in the idea that somebody is an upstart. Right? It's a kind of idea, avan nelakadla vittu nadanna aala, ippo kando. Right? That kind of, that's the attitude that's embodied in that, but now it's entered everyday conversation. So to become attentive to the words that come out of your mouth, that is where knowledge starts. Words come to us, as the Russian thinker Mikhail Bakhtin put it, words come to us from the mouths of people, not from dictionaries. This is the credo that should underline decolonization, not a return to ancient philosophy, but that's a choice. I mean, Ambedkar himself read Indian thought very seriously in order to find a place within. It's when he didn't that he left, right?
I find it very interesting that this I don't know, demand or request, what do you want to call it, for us to switch to Malayalam came when a Dalit woman is sitting on the dais, because it's so easy to be disruptive, isn't it? When you have someone who's from a marginalized background on stage, and this didn't come when Professor Dilip Menon was talking, it came when I was talking. And so, in many ways, when we're trying to make intelligible certain concepts which were crushed, which were oppressed, particularly by the tyranny of language, you have certain kind of tensions and frictions which emerge, which is also normalized, which needs to be critiqued. So when we're talking about the long history of words and concepts moving across the world, we also have to talk about words which did not move, words which did not foray into other lands. Now, Laura Schrebinger, in her wonderful work on plants, power and knowledge, she talks about African slavery and how African American women, they had particular words which were actually English terms, because these were women who did not come from any particular tribe or from any particular part of Africa. So they invented their own languages, and these words were very similar to English. But these words wouldn't be conveyed to their masters. And these words contained worlds of knowledge, particularly about botanical knowledge, because the wealth of knowledge that they had about the botanical world, that was unparalleled. And one particular case study that she uses is about abortifacients, where certain herbs were used for abortions, and these women were also victims of rape, and they had to preserve that knowledge and also convey that knowledge to fellow slave women at that point of time. So it's important for us to also talk about non-circulations when we're talking about circulation. So one such term is tayam or marimakatayam that we had. Now another word that I have found in a lot of works in Kerala, but which has not found equivalence in other languages, even in Indian languages, is the term kura. It is something that is very closely associated with the idea of state formation in Kerala, where kura can mean loyalty, but it can also be a group. It can also be a subswarupam like Vadakkam Kura or Tekkam Kura, where a group now becomes a regional formation. Now there are also these terms, this and an interrogation of terms which might not flow so easily, while having significant pertinent roles in the local epistemological traditions as well as in state formation. These are also terms which are interrogated in your work, which is quite fascinating.
I'm so glad, Malavika, that you used this as a teaching session. There was a voice from the back which objected to Malavika speaking in English. Did not object to my speaking in English. It was an attempt at caste disciplining that was happening there. As Malavika rightly pointed out, the idea of a Dalit woman sitting on stage speaking in English doesn't please certain people. Right? So I think if I were to write an essay on this space here, this is the instance with which I would begin. That's where I begin to write my sociology. As to words that don't travel, I think this is an important question, because very often the early enterprises in knowledge, in decolonizing knowledge, ask the wrong kind of question. So, for example, Dipesh Chakravarti, when he wrote Provincializing Europe, he said, we constantly ask ourselves questions like, why is there no capitalism in India? Why is there no revolution in India? Instead of asking, what is it that we have in India? Not what is it that we don't have, and trying to explain a series of negatives. Right? So similarly, when we talk about words as well, it's not necessary that words are commensurable, right? That one word can be translated into another word. So early attempts at writing African philosophy tried to model themselves on English analytical philosophy and ask questions like, do we have considerations on mind, matter, logic in African philosophy? And the answer was no. Rather than asking the question, how is it that African or Asian people think about the world, conceive the world, how do they locate themselves within the world? So when we talk about words that do not travel, we have to have the conviction that our knowledge and our descriptions of the world matter, that they cannot be subordinated to theories that come from elsewhere. So for example, think about a lot of the writings on caste in the 1980s. The idea was that, look, given time, caste will become class. Then we can write about class, right? Because that's what we are more comfortable doing. Right? And so questions of caste, so subaltern studies, which is one of the most radical interventions in the writing of Indian histories, 12 volumes appeared, 11 volumes without caste. The 12th volume included caste, Dalits and tribals. And with that, subaltern studies ended. That was the end of the project. Right? So there's a deep irony here, a deep irony that we have to acknowledge, that there are life experiences that are probably incommensurable, that one word does not travel easily, and we need to be uncomfortable about that. Think about the fact that we educate ourselves in order to use words like French words. Like a lot of Indian scholars are very comfortable pronouncing French words like jouissance or déférence, and they're familiar with the face of the other, but they're not familiar with words in Indian languages. They mispronounce even words in their own languages, and this is a matter of great pride. How do we acknowledge this cleft that we are stuck in? Right? How do we acknowledge the fact that we need this constant recognition that comes from elsewhere, whether from the upper caste, from Europe, from America, Of course, there is a larger political economy of publishing, journals. So you submit article to a prestigious journal, as they're called, and prestigious journals are usually located somewhere else, not here. So when you submit, and they say, look, have you read X, Y, and Z? And the answer should be, well, X, Y, and Z, who write in French, German, or Italian, are not relevant to my enterprise. I'd rather look to thinkers from here, but we haven't got there yet. So when we talk about decolonization, it's a project that we will engage in first within oneself, right? To understand that we are the products of an unthinking hierarchy, where words have come to us without saying, and so therefore they go without saying, right? Where we use words in everyday language that are demeaning, that have histories of hierarchy, to fight against that, to argue against it, to wrestle with them, and then to generate words that may or may not translate into a vocabulary of social science that comes to us from Europe or America. And here is where the Caribbean thinker Edouard Glissant, in his work, speaks about this idea of opacity. Right? You know, transparent is something you can see through, opaque is something that you can only barely sense what is there. So he says we need to dwell in opacity. Now, it doesn't mean this as a permanent strategy. That's not the idea. This opacity is a matter of time. That we need to take time in order to dwell on the meanings of our words and to understand them before we very quickly translate them into social science vocabulary. Right? So words that do not travel are crucial to our enterprise. Stay with them, dwell with them, think about the hardness, think about their untranslatability. Thank you for a great set of questions.
Thank you so much. On the question of unintelligibility, there are several feminist scholars who have interrogated language. But we also had these clarion calls of maybe having a feminist language if ever one is possible. But what I'm truly thankful for you to producing this work, because it truly, I think, drives down this point that one has to be multilingual, not in terms of language, but in terms of our thinking, in terms of how we imagine our worlds are created. And I think that's a beautiful concept, but it's also a concept that the world desperately needs now. So, for instance, when you're talking about a certain kind of amnesia, you start your essay with this idea of amnesia, that the world that has crept into the world and we have so absolutely unquestioningly embraced that Europe is the epicenter of all philosophy. And similar to that, we also have this conception that state formation has to emerge or would have happened according to certain models which were set by European thinkers. So this particular essay by Saul Thomas in your work about Windsor, again, then please do correct me if the pronunciation is incorrect.
I don't know Mandarin either.
It's a Chinese word, Windsor, where he talks about the possibilities of an indigenous state formation, or whether it is possible at all. For instance, he asked the question whether the state is always ephemeral, whether it is always an ambiguous, ambivalent concept, which I think it's a very powerful way to think about the state, that you need not think about it as a definitive entity. And particularly since I'm someone who works on the early modern and pre-modern state formation situation, it is helpful for me as a historian, and I'm very sure that it will be helpful for a lot of history scholars, for us to also unpack the ways in which we think about the state. Quite often, we are pushed into thinking about the state as having these classic features and state formation following this unilinear pattern. So this interrogation, and he lifts it open-ended, which is what is fascinating, absolutely fascinating about the essay, that maybe there are ways and maybe there are no ways. So do we actually have to pursue this idea of state formation in indigenous context within given frameworks, or in negotiation with those frameworks that we have? Because constantly we are being informed by it, even if we are struggling against it, even if we are critiquing it, even if we are looking for indigenous epistemes, the state always informs your thinking, and the idea of the state is still the very European state. I hope I made sense.
Yeah, no, you do. I mean, actually, it's just that your questions are so huge. I'm trying to find a way to answering them because I think this question of the state and the question of the nation are central questions for us. Because it's important to remember that the nation is a young form, right? It hasn't been there since the beginning of time. Nations invent history, so when Nehru writes Discovery of India, he suddenly finds the origins of India in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa 5,000 years ago. But the Indian nation comes into existence in 1947. And it is an idea that is still being contested even now. Right? Think about the tussle between the present Prime Minister and a dead Prime Minister. Right? So when you think about all of this, and you think also about the question of the state, when you think about the Indian state is still in the process of establishing its control over large parts of India. Right? And there are large parts of India which have been left to the control of what are called feudal elements. People are killed, and there is no rule of law. Right? So when we ask ourselves whether the nation, the state involve the creation of the rule of law, the monopoly of violence, if we think with Weber, we're going to get nowhere. You have to understand Indian society within quotes and the Indian state within quotes in ways in which we see it manifested in the places that we occupy. So long ago, sometime in, I think it was in the 80s, the historian Anand Yang wrote a book called The Limited Raj. And what he was arguing there was that when you think about Bihar, right, that there were these large spaces which are of Hathras, the Darbhanga, the big zamindaris, where the East India Company decided, look, it's not important to conquer them. They just need to give us the revenue. They can do pretty much what they like in these spaces. If they're going to kill people, that's fine. But so long as the revenue is guaranteed. So hence the idea of the limited Raj. So the idea of the state in India is a compromise, right? Where the state allows elites to practice whatever it is that they are doing in order to maintain law and order. So it's delegated, right? The state delegates its monopoly of violence to multiple functionaries. So the state doesn't exist as one entity, it's a dispersed entity. So when we talk about the state, how important is it to go back to the classic Marxist literature or the classic sociological literature? It's a very important question that you've raised, because for us, a lot of us experience the state as violence. Think about Omar Khalid, right? For a few words, he's in prison. So when we encounter the state not in its benevolence, not as pastoral care, as Michel Foucault puts it, not in terms of a governmentality, but the state as a sovereign. The state has the right of life and death over us. So given all of this, I think we need to question the categories that we so easily employ in our speech, in our academic works, because we have to work with what we see around us. We can't work with ideal types. Right? So to give you a very, very simple example, when I went to teach at the University of Hyderabad, which is in Telangana, and Telangana, as you know, is still a fairly backward region, the large number of students there were from Dalit families. Their parents were agricultural laborers, so they would go back after their master's classes in the holidays to work in the fields, carry headloads. And one of the things that I had to get used to at that point was one, that as in the first class, the students said, you must learn how to speak English like us. And that was a lesson I took to heart. That when I speak, I have to be understood. That is the function of speech, right? That somebody has to understand what you're saying. The second thing, which was a far more horrific experience, was that as I got to know the students better, and we would hang around together in the gym, and I'd casually reach across to put my arm on somebody's shoulder, and they would shrink back because they knew that they must not get used to this. To go back to the villages that they lived in, where they were not allowed to wear slippers, they couldn't touch everybody, they were given clay pots to drink tea. The luxury of touch was not something that they should get used to. So there are many things that you learn not from books. You learn from the landscape which you occupy, and the landscape which I occupy with a certain degree of privilege, the landscape which Malavika occupies, where education and the possession of language is given her a certain kind of privilege, but not entirely. Right? So we're all working with this kind of, in this interstices of power. And we, with eyes fixated on the state, in the glare of the state, you're blinded by this desire. It's like Hegel said, first a few people have the state, then everybody has the state. And that's the transition that we desire, but that's not the way it works. And because we experience the state in dispersed ways, we experience the state through its violence, and we experience the state as something that is still not there, it's still not complete, it's a limited Raj. So,
it's absolutely coincidentally, I was also teaching at a university in Guntur, and I had a similar experience where I used to make the students call me Akka, because they used to refer to all of us as either as Miss, and I used to tell them, sorry, it's not a Miss anymore. And at the same time, for me, I was still a fresh doctorate at that point of time. So to make them call me Dr. Malavika, it seemed like an overkill. Right. So I used to make them call me Akka, but then one or two of them would come back to me and say, no, we're ending up in trouble because we have this tendency that when another teacher comes, we'll end up calling her Akka as well, and then that person might not like it. So you are actually creating trouble, even more trouble for us. But that is something that also happens. When you try to replace, but that doesn't mean replace a colonial practice of calling a teacher as a sir or madam with something else. That also leads to other kinds of intersectional problems, because again there's a power imposition from my side where it is my self-image that I am trying to bolster as being the favorite of the students, as being a sister to the students. But what I ended up doing was to give them more trouble. And it got to a point where students in my class were sitting according to caste, and then I had to use my power as a teacher to make them sit as individuals, not based on caste. But then I would always think, is this me? I am also then they might prefer to sit with their friends who belong to their own caste, and they might be coming from the same Dalit Wadis. And now I am forcing students who are from elite backgrounds to sit, or Dalit students to sit with students from elite backgrounds, which is uncomfortable for both of them.
right.
So there is a certain kind of power that is exercised, no matter how you try to unpack it, no matter how much you try to not exude power. So it is impossible for us, particularly in locales where we still have the Damocles sword of the specter of colonialism hovering over us, to totally decolonize ourselves. Now, Professor KATHA, in his wonderful work, Epistemologies of the Oppressed, he talks about decoloniality as opposed to decolonization, where on the one hand, he speaks about the decolonization of the mind, but he also talks about the process of healing. How it is only through embracing the truly indigenous, but at the same time, us trying to create new kinds of selves, which are, and us trying to embrace a certain kind of powerlessness rather than creating other kinds of power structures, that we can break out of this colonial mentality that has been imposed on us. Now, several of the chapters in your work also talk about this attempt to move away from the colonial wound or the process of healing. And for historians and for scholars who are from the global south, when we engage in knowledge production, do you think that we might end up, this is also a personal concern that I have, that we might end up, like the case of subaltern histories that you mentioned, that we might end up making another framework which is impossible for the marginalized again to access. So, and how do we overcome that?
Yeah, actually the problem here is that we tend to think about knowledge in terms of revolution. That here is this paradigm, now that must be overturned, and then we create another paradigm. So one universal is replaced by another universal, but I don't think that's the way we need to think about this, because very often knowledge is an accretion, a process of accretion. So hence, to use an old-fashioned vocabulary, we have to arrive at a synthesis, right? There is the dialectic and there's a synthesis and so on. But it is this question of connecting knowledge to life that we have not done. In our entire system of pedagogy in India, when people start PhDs and they start MPhils and so on, they choose something called a topic, right? And the topic is very often given to the student, like the priest at Padmanabha Swami Chetan drops into your hand, right? So go work on this. And they work on things like environment, state, this, that, and the other, because there is this idea that look, we need to work on the existing paradigm. So to ask the question, why does this matter to me? Right? What am I working on? How is it going to change me? Right? Rather than change society, that's a big thing, right? We all have dreams of changing society, but how is this going to change me? And in the process of changing me, how will this work resonate with somebody else who has the same experience as I do? And a lot of the work that we have seen that has broken the mold is when people ask the question, where am I in this field of knowledge that I work in? Think about the origins of Black feminist thought in the USA. Think about the origins of Dalit historiography. It's a fundamental question. Where am I in this large field of knowledge? What is my positionality? Why does it matter to me? How will this change me? These are the questions, not questions that are abstract questions. And so when I was teaching again in Hyderabad, and students would come and say, I need to work on a PhD. And they'd say, can I work on nationalism? Or can I work on communism or communalism and environment and so on? I'd say, look, but how does this relate to you as a person? What is it that you bring to this? And very often I had people say, look, my mother used to sing these songs back in the village. I say, well, and obviously that matters to you. Do your MPhil on that. Or somebody said that their grandfather had written diaries, as in Manipur, who had created an entire alphabet and a system of numbers, right? And I said, work on those diaries. That's where you have your connection. And through a whole process of engaging with the everyday, with the minute, it's a kind of work that Kancha Ilaya has been asking us to do on labor. Of course, Kancha Ilaya has gone over to the dark side. That's another question that we won't go into here. But this question of dealing with the everyday, what is around us, how we change ourselves, that should be the substance of this work rather than some exalted object that stands above you. So when you enter the process of learning and teaching and research and so on, the first thing you have to ask yourself is, how is this going to change me? How is it going to help me see better the world around me? And how is it that we are going to be establish those connections, those filiations? How do we finally create a society? This is the wonderful phrase from Aniket Zavre's book, Practicing Caste, where he says that we first have to establish sociability before we can think about society. Okay? And this is the thing that Ambedkar said, where he said, I do not base myself on the French Revolution of liberty, equality, fraternity. Because liberty and equality you can put into the constitution, you can legislate it. Fraternity comes from the heart. Right? Fraternity is something that cannot be legislated. You can't force somebody to sit and have compassion for somebody else. And this is, of course, the substance of Narayana Guru's thinking as well, but that's a whole field which I shan't get into. So our work should be the means in which we connect to ourselves and we connect to a life out there. And that's really what decoloniality in its exhaustive sense would mean. It's not just about rebelling against Eurocentrism and rebelling against Foucault and so on. It's a question of what's it that I have to do? Remember that wonderful phrase from The Tempest, where Caliban, who's been subordinated by Prospero the magician, says, you've taught me language and my profit on it is I know how to curse. Right? And that's what we are doing. All this post-colonial criticism has been merely cursing. We curse and rant and say, look, European knowledge, this, that, and the other. What is it that we have to do? There's work to be done. We have to do that work. We have to work with the languages, work with life, work with experience, engage in conversations, establish filiations.
Thank you for that very insightful answer. I was saving this one question for the last because I think the heart of the of your work lies there, which is on moments of intellection that you talk about, where there are moments of departure, the moments of maneuver, and the moments of arrival. And for the, I would love it if for the audience you could explain. That's something that Partha Chatterjee uses, but you bring a whole new dimension to it, particularly in understanding societies which had the bane of colonialism on it. So, if for our audience, if you could just very briefly, because I know that we are running out of time, could briefly talk about these moments of intellection that you talk about with regard to knowledge production, it would be wonderful.
Yeah, actually, I'll answer this briefly because we tend to assume that there's something called theory with a capital T that's done by intellectuals with a capital I and so on. We are thinking, analyzing all the time. This is what Borges said. Breathing it's like the respiration of the intelligence. Like thinking is like the respiration of the intelligence. Just as we breathe, we think. And that's where we need to begin, where we don't think about the act of intellection as something that is conducted in a library, on a scholarship to Oxford. It's conducted here and now. Just as when we had the interruption, that Udukkuga, that happened here, saying don't speak in English to Malavika. That's where we need to begin, right? In the moments around us, where that is the point of rupture at which we begin to think, so what explains this, right? And what are the consequences of this? So, to go back to Borges, intellection is available to everybody. It is not to be conducted in a library, it's to be conducted in every day. Thank you.
Okay, I'm getting a word from the organizers that we are running out of time. So thank you so much, Professor Dilip Menon, and thank you, audience.